So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this session. Today we'll be talking about going beyond responsive design, about all the new and cool media features that we have available to us today. So before going beyond responsive design, like just a few quick messages. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and I'll either answer them directly or get to them at the end. And yeah, let's go. So before discussing what's next, let's review the term responsive design itself. So responsive design by now is kind of a household term, and it basically lets us adapt our website to various screen sizes. So it was introduced in an article by Ethan Marcotte, which is now over 11 years ago. And while I'm sure everyone here has some idea of what responsive design is, I wanted to get a definition on screen anyway. So I think responsive design is the way a website adapts to different screen sizes, and it does that by reflowing and repositioning content as the available space allows. So we do this by using media queries and flexibly sized elements, using relative minimum and maximum sizes. And more recently, things like Flexbox, Grid, and CSS functions like clamp and min and max have allowed us to do this in even easier ways. But there was a time before responsive design, and we did things a little differently then. In 2008, I wrote an article on Naar Voren, a then well-known Dutch front-end website, on handheld style sheets. They used the now deprecated handheld media type. Right now we have the screen and the print media types, but back then people thought that we would have media types for everything, handhelds, TVs, anything you can imagine. So support back then for handheld style sheets, even though they were the only way to do this, was, as you expect, pretty terrible, with just a handful of browsers like Opera Mini and Mobile Internet Explorer supporting just a tiny bit of CSS. But that's not why I'm sharing this today. I ended this article with a glimmer of hope. Soon we will be able to use media queries, and that would allow us to respond to device widths, heights, and I really wrote this, the number of colors on the screen. Back then, Opera 9 and Safari 3 already supported this new standard. So things have changed a fair bit since then. The mobile internet and media queries are here to stay. And over a decade in, support for media queries is terrific. Like literally everything understands media queries. And we also have a pretty solid understanding nowadays of how responsive design should be approached. So I think responsive design should be mobile first. It should be done with media queries with widths in ems. You should use a base font size of 16 pixels, which is the same as 1em. You should always allow user resizing. And of course, scrolling is fine because there is no fold. So we also want to make sure that our media queries are either max or min widths, but not both, just to keep things manageable. And right now, because we know what responsive design is, it's time to move on and go and do something that's maybe a little less well supported, combined with perhaps a new term, like responsive websites that actively adapt to user preferences using user preference media queries. So in web development, we usually reason about what a device can do, but we really want to be responsive to the user, their environment and their preferences. The device they use is really just a proxy. And I think our website should respond to 4 main areas. So firstly, user preferences, their environment, their network conditions, and lastly, their device capabilities. Today, we'll go over each of these and see what's possible in each of these categories. So not everything I'll be discussing today will be equally well supported, but for each feature, I'll share in which evergreen browser or operating system it already works. So very quickly throughout this presentation, I will use Polypane, which is a web browser that I make. So if you see a weird looking browser showing off a media query, that's Polypane. First up, the user preferences. So there's a lot of these, and you might not have heard of all of them yet. But that's okay, because half of these don't have great support yet. But we'll go over them anyway, and we'll start with prefers color scheme, or as most of us know it, dark mode. So prefers color scheme indicates whether your user prefers to see a light or a dark version of your site. They might prefer a dark version because it's usually easier on the eyes. Conversely, they might prefer a light version because it usually has increased contrast compared to the dark mode version. So both of these can be beneficial to your visitor. Using the prefers color scheme media query, we can check for both the dark and the light values. There used to be a no preference value as well, but it got removed since it was essentially the same as light mode in all the browsers that implemented prefers color scheme. So most of you will have a website in light mode because it's kind of the default. And adding a dark mode from scratch can be a very big project if you want to do it right. And if you want to add dark mode, but you don't have a lot of time, then you can use something that I call cheap dark mode. And it works like this. First, we invert the entire page using the invert filter. This makes everything that's dark light and the other way around. Unfortunately, what this also does is invert the hue. So anything that's blue becomes orange, for example. And that's not great because you can't have your brand color suddenly be different. So we add another filter called hue rotate, and we rotate the hue by 180 degrees, which means that we end up with the original hue. It won't match your colors perfectly, but it's usually close enough. At this point, however, all your images and videos will look pretty bad because they've been inverted and their colors have been changed. So we need to fix that. And the way we can fix that is just by adding the same invert and hue rotate filter again, basically undoing the previous one. And so all the images and videos then become back, are their normal view again. And at this point, everything looks okay except for the background because it hasn't changed along. And we need to add an explicit background color. So this one, 111, is dark gray, but you can also add a bit of color depending on what works best for your website. I do advise not using full black because it's usually way too contrasting for your visitors. Now, this cheap dark mode isn't perfect. That's why it's cheap dark mode. And it's not as good as a fully custom dark theme, but it will get you something decent in a few lines of code. So here's what that looks like. On the left, the regular side, and on the right, the cheap dark mode one. So that's not bad at all for just a few lines of code. Now on to prefers reduced motion. With this, users can indicate they want to see less stuff happening on screen. The reason they want to do this can be things like motion sickness, vestibular disorders that can cause nausea or dizziness. The animations can be distracting to them due to something like ADD, or just that they don't have the time to wait for your nice animations. So if a user has prefers reduced motion turned on, it doesn't mean you can't show any motion, but you do have to be mindful. Use motion only where it helps understanding, and prefer animations that fade rather than move. And of course, for videos, make sure you don't autoplay them like the Apple website did here. So prefers reduced motion can take two values. Either it's no preference or reduce. And the best way to approach using prefers reduced motion is to consider motion as an enhancement. You design your site without motion, and you only add in animations when the user has set prefers reduced motion to no preference. But again, if that's not an option or the site is already built, you can also use the prefers reduce motion reduce option to turn animations off. And you can do that, for example, using cheap reduce motion. So what you see here is very, very crude because it will just turn all animations and transitions off, including the ones that weren't a problem because there was no motion involved. You can also see some weird values like -1 milliseconds. And that's to make sure that the animations still play, except that they take 0 seconds. This way, any JavaScript APIs that depend on the animation end and transition end events will still be called. So if you do end up using this, make sure that everything is still visible. For example, with transitions from transparent to opaque, you don't want your user to miss any of your content. And of course, for videos, you want to turn off autoplaying. We can do that by using some JavaScript. In JavaScript, there's an API called window.matchMedia, and you can add in a media query there. And the .matches property is a Boolean that tells you if this media query matches or not. So this way you can check whether or not a user prefers their videos to autoplay. On to prefers contrast. So prefers contrast indicates whether your user wants to show your site with less or more contrast. So visual impairments can make it difficult to pick up subtle differences in color. So people that have that will prefer a higher contrast. On the other hand, people with light sensitivity issues might prefer a screen with some less harsh contrasts. So while support is not great yet, it's available in the Safari technology previews, which supports just the more value, and in Chromium, which supports all values. So prefers contrast more is turned on when the user turns on the increase contrast accessibility option in macOS. It's supported in Firefox as well, though it's not active by default and it needs to be turned on in the settings. I'm showing this screenshot so you can see where you can set this option, but also so you can see what Apple itself does when this feature is turned on. It doesn't increase the text contrast, so it doesn't suddenly show everything with full black on full white, but you can see that all the different areas now have very, very clear borders around them, rather than, subtle box shadows or light color differences. And this way, it makes it much easier to see which areas belong together. So that's something you can also do on your site when the prefers contrast more option is turned on. That leaves prefers contrast custom. What does that mean? If it's custom, does it mean more contrast or less? Or neither, but somehow still preferring something? Well, prefers contrast custom used to be called prefers contrast forced, and it would match when forced colors was active. That keyword got removed, and now custom came in its place. We'll discuss forced colors more in a few minutes, but I think prefers contrast custom is pretty vague and a little bit misguided. The goal for this is to provide a hook in your media queries for multiple situations where a user wants overall reduced visual complexity, like less images, less shadows, less gradients. And by making the valueless prefers contrast apply when forced colors is active, as well as when any other value is active. The idea is by giving one hook for this, people can reduce complexity for all situations, like more contrast, less contrast, or forced colors. So my personal opinion is that with adoption of user preference media queries already being low, I think this is pretty confusing and probably won't be used a lot, but we'll see. Now, while the previous media queries are supported across browsers, the next few have no or very limited support. So consider them more a preview of upcoming media queries. With prefers reduced transparency, users can indicate they want to see text on a solid background. They want this usually due to visual impairments, making it hard to read text on a patterned background, but it can also help people with dyslexia or concentration problems. Unfortunately, though, there is no browser support yet. Like reduced motion, there's two options, and one supports lens. Consider again to make the reduced case the default, and only add your transparencies when the no preference media query matches. Also, a quick note, wanting less transparency is not the same as preferring more contrast, even though it might seem like they're very similar. They're different media queries that solve different issues for different people. So keep that in mind. Inverted colors is an option that is only supported on macOS. You'll notice it doesn't start with prefers, and that's because the operating system, macOS, and the browser, Safari, have already inverted the colors for you. And you might think that you need to use this media query to double invert images and videos, like we did for the cheap dark mode, but Safari already does this for you as well. You can, however, still U-shift your entire site to make sure your brand colors are still followed. In general, I think prefers color scheme and dark mode in macOS are more or less like the successors to this setting and this media query. So I don't think you'll get a lot of use out of this one, but it exists, so we're discussing it. The values look like this. It's either none or inverted. On the Windows side, we have something called forced colors, which maps to the Windows high contrast mode. Windows high contrast mode lets users specify and override all the colors on their operating system. Usually this is used to create very high contrast black on white or white on black color schemes, but it can also be used for sepia or even wilder color schemes. Users can configure their colors as they want. So high contrast mode is a bit of a misnomer. As this media query also does not begin with prefers, your browser has already overwritten all the colors on your site and has made everything uniform with the rest of your operating system. If you compare the two screenshots here, you can see some of the Chrome browser at the top and of course the Windows taskbar on the bottom, and you can see those have been changed as well. So essentially this makes everything on screen uniform. Now, a month ago, I would have told you that you needed a Windows device and turned forced colors mode on for your entire device to be able to work with this or test forced color mode. But that recently changed. In Chromium-based browsers like Edge, Chrome, and Polypane, which is shown here, you can now turn on forced color emulation, which is incredibly useful. Not in the least because it means your DevTools won't also be in forced color mode, which can be a bit of a shock when you turn that on for the first time. So make sure to test this. The active keyword for forced colors will tell you if it's active or not. And in addition, if a white text on black background color scheme is chosen, prefers color scheme dark will also match. So you can combine these two media queries, forced colors and prefers color scheme, to figure out if you're in a light mode or dark mode situation for these users. Now, because all the colors have already been overwritten by the browser, there's not really much for you to do, except make sure that things like SVG icons are still visible and that you can add borders around elements that were previously different because they had a different background color. However, you don't know which color scheme the user decides to use, so you can't use your own colors for this. Instead, you need to use these CSS color names like canvas text for text and canvas for your background color. When you search online, you'll find the advice that SVG icons will follow along with these colors when you use current color, but that is currently broken in Chromium browsers due to a specification change. So a fix for that is coming, but for now, if you use SVGs, you have to set the color explicitly to either like button text or link text or canvas text, depending on what matches the current SVG. Now, what if your colors are important and you don't want them overwritten? For example, when you're showing color swatches for a product in a web shop. You can opt out of forced colors with the forced colors adjust none CSS property and value. Now, make sure that you use this just for the elements where your chosen colors are important and not for entire pages or sections. Now, these three options, forced colors, prefers contrast, and inverted colors, don't serve the same purpose. So forced colors overrides all your styling to something that your user wanted, often with significantly increased contrast, but not necessarily so. With prefers contrast, which begins with prefers, it's your job to increase the contrast, but the user would still like to see your design choices and your colors. Lastly, inverted colors has no such explicit goal, but it's mostly used to make screens less bright. Speaking of making screens less bright, the light level media query lets us respond literally to the user's environment. The operating system will tell browsers, once support for this lens, whether the environment is dark, normal, or bright, like when you're in broad daylight. There's three values for this media query. There's dim for dark environments, normal for average one, and washed for a bright environment. Now, operating systems already use light sensors to dim or brighten the screen. And on your site, you could use them to decrease the blues when it's dark or increase the text contrast when it's bright, so that text still remains readable on a screen reflecting a lot of light. Now, for prefers reduced data, not everyone is lucky enough to have fast or reliable internet or unlimited data plans. Like, not everyone can stream live video. Browsers can send the saved data on header, and web servers can then choose to send smaller images and videos and disable any form of preloading, server push, or polling. Unfortunately, doing this on a server is often very hard to do because you as a developer lack access to the server configuration, or the configuration requirements are just too complex. And that's unfortunate because it can have a very big impact on who gets to see and use your website. Coming up is the prefers reduced data media query. It's not available in browsers yet, but you can emulate it after changing some settings in Chrome and out of the box in Polypane. So ideally, you'd implement the reduced data version of your site as the default version, just like the prefers reduced motion media query. And only when the user has no preference for reduced data, you give them the quote-unquote full-fat experience. Unfortunately, because there's no browser support at the moment, this means that everyone gets the reduced data experience, and that's probably not something you can get buy-in for right now. So for most situations, we have to switch it around and implement our data preserving features in a prefers reduced data reduce media query. The nice thing is that while this won't do anything now, it will automatically start improving your site once support lands for the media query. When you get down to it, there are three file types that cause the majority of web page weight. There's images, fonts, and videos. We'll discuss strategies for each of these, starting with fonts. So the nice thing about fonts in CSS is that they're only downloaded when they actually get used on the page, as opposed to when you define them in CSS with @fontface. So if you fall back on the system font in the reduced data case, you prevent a potentially large font file from downloading at all. Using the system font is usually a fine alternative and has the bonus of always looking readable to your visitor. You can always choose to send a smaller subsetted font when the chosen font is important for the branding of your site, for example. And then use it just for the branding and ship only the characters you use to keep everything as small as possible. Alternatively, For a progressively enhanced version, you can add the add font face declaration in a no preference block. Because the add font face then doesn't exist in the reduced situation, the first available fallback font will be chosen. Now, background images tend to be large, so if you can replace them with a solid color or gradient, then that should be your first choice for the reduced data case. You can think of background images as a way to enhance your page when the user is fine with using more data. Now, if the background image is essential, you'll want to consider three things. Either use a modern format like WebP or AVF. These are smaller than their JPEG or PNG counterparts. The new versions of browsers that implement preferred reduced data will have support for these formats. And for the reduced data image, you can also choose to use a smaller image and just zoom that in a little bit. It won't look perfect or it won't look as nice, but it could be good enough. Or you can also choose to use a large image, but with a much lower quality setting. The quality can be set much lower for large images and formats like WebP and AVF, because they have algorithms that make sure that high detail areas of the image remain clear even if the quality is set too low. Now, to serve smaller content images, meaning the images on your page, we can use the picture element and provide a source with the prefers reduced data media query like so. While there is no support, this media query will evaluate to false and the source will be ignored. And then it will start matching once support lands and will automatically start using the lower quality image. Here again, you have the choice of serving a smaller image or the same size with less quality. You have to experiment to find what works and, for example, use squoosh.app to figure out the sweet spot for your images. Now, while it is generally a nice experience when a video has buffered by the time you press play, that involves downloading at least part of the video in advance. And when a user prefers to less data, it means that they will also be okay with having to wait for a while for a video to start when they press play. So to implement this in a graceful degradation way, we need to set the autoplay and preload attributes when there either is no support for prefers reduced data, or there is support for prefers reduced data and it's turned off, or there's no preference. For that, we need a little bit of hacky CSS inside JavaScript. The window.matchMedia API, again, lets us test if a given media query applies to the current page. And the media query that you see here is a little bit confusing, but essentially what it says is if prefers reduced data does not match, or prefers reduced data does match, then it evaluates to true. Because of the comma, which is an or in CSS, it will always be understood and evaluate to true if we support prefers reduced data, regardless of if it's turned on or not. However, if the browser does not understand prefers reduced data, it will ignore this media query, and that will result in it evaluating to false. So this media query will tell you if prefers reduced data is supported at all. Now, if you'd like a deeper explanation of how this media query works, I wrote an article about that at bit.ly/detect-media-query-support. Now, after we check if it's supported at all, we also check for the no preference directly, and we use the same window.matchMedia API for that. This no preference variable will be false either when reduce is true or when there is no support. That means that we can combine the support and the no preference values to figure out if we can autoplay like so. Now you can either autoplay and preload when there is no support in the browser or when there is support and the user has no reduced data preference. By setting the attribute with JavaScript and not in the HTML, we make sure that we default to not autoplaying and not preloading when the JavaScript doesn't load. As an additional note, before you autoplay videos, make sure that the user doesn't also have the prefers reduced motion media query set to reduce. And you can use the same window.matchMedia API for this. Even though prefers reduced data is not available yet, you can detect the saved data header in JavaScript with the navigator.connection API and use that to prevent any preloading from happening. It's available in Chromium and behind the flag in Firefox. The API can also tell you if someone is on a slow connection with effective type. This doesn't just check the type of connection, but also the connection speed and how long it took to connect to the server to give you an approximate connection type. So a user could be on Wi-Fi, but if it's very spotty Wi-Fi, the effective type could still be slow 2G. You can combine these to test for a preference to use less data or a connection that could benefit from less data being transferred. Now, even though the device is a proxy to the user and their preferences, we're also getting more information about the device and its capabilities. Two of these are screen inset and the interaction media queries. So with the advent of notched phones, Apple also introduced a new viewport property called viewport fit cover. Without it, your site would be shown with these ugly bands on the left and right side of the screen to prevent it from being covered up by the notch. Now, when you turn viewport fit cover on, your site goes from edge to edge, but now the notch sits over the content. And since you don't know how large the notch is, and you don't know on which side the notch is, Apple came up with a clever solution for this. And they introduced a set of CSS environment variables that you can use in your CSS to make sure your content isn't obscured by a notch or other overlaid UI. You can use them in a similar way to CSS variables. And of course, Android phones also got notches, so this feature is also available in Chrome for Android. Note though that these environment variables don't provide any extra padding. So if you just use these, your content will be flush against the edges. If you want to add extra padding, you need to combine them with calc to make sure that there's some space between the edge and your content. Lastly, I want to point out the interaction media queries. They are supported across the board in all evergreen browsers. Now, we have many different input devices nowadays compared to when the web got started. Mouses still exist, but we also have touch, styluses, external controllers like a Wii controller, and even things like hand detection with a Kinect or AR glasses. Things that are easy to do with a mouse can be harder with these other devices. Hovering might not be available, and precise clicking something might be next to impossible. With these media queries, you can adapt to these input devices in clever ways. So consider touch devices as the most minimal device. It doesn't have hover, and your input device is your thumb, which makes it hard to point precisely at a small target. From there, devices with a stylus add precision, but no hover. Wii controllers add hover, but no precision. And lastly, a mouse or trackpad has hover and precise clicking. Now, these media queries only check the primary input device, but a user might use multiple input devices on a single computer. So make sure your UI works with all of them. And you can check for all input devices with any dash hover and any dash pointer. So that's our roundup of the new and upcoming ways we can respond to user preferences, their network environment, and device capabilities. With these, we can optimize and personalize the experience they have with your website by responding to their preferences, creating truly responsive websites. I'm Kilian Valkhof, and you can find me in these places. Thank you for listening, and have fun at the rest of the festival. So Johnny asks, how do you test all these different cases? Like one by one. You can write automated tests for them. Browsers have ways to emulate all of these. However, each of them require specific changes that you should test, ideally with users. And users can also combine them, of course. So a user can have a preference for dark mode and a preference for more contrast. So it's going to be very difficult, or at least a whole lot of work, to support all of these media queries on your site. And realistically, you won't be able to do that. So what I would advise people is to go for the most valuable media queries given the time you have. And those would be reduce motion, because if you have motion on your site, then you're excluding people from being able to use your site. So that's not a great thing. Prefers color scheme is nice, but having dark mode is not a must. For the people that really require a dark mode, depending on prefers color scheme is tricky, because not all websites have a dark mode. So those users, that set of users, will more likely use either the inverted colors media query or the forced colors media query. So making sure your site works with forced colors is more important than making sure you have your own dark mode. So that's how I would go about that.